Something very big is happening in the Caribbean Sea. In the past few weeks, American warships have not only stopped Venezuelan ships here, fired missiles at them, but have also seized some of those ships. In response, Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro deployed his navy ships in these waters, turning this sea, once known as a paradise for tourists, into a battle zone. But the question is, why is America opening a new war front so close to its own borders? And why has Venezuela, which was once a collapsing petrostate, suddenly become so important? And how is it that the Caribbean's geography, its oil reserves, and its history all together are making it so crucial for America? Be sure to watch this video till the end, because today we're going to talk about the past, present, and future of this conflict, whose impact will not only be felt in the Western Hemisphere, but across the entire world. To understand why the situation in the Caribbean Sea is deteriorating so much, let's first take a look at its geography. The Caribbean Sea may look small, but its location makes it extremely important in world politics. It lies just about 150 kilometers south of Florida, right next to the United States, and not only connects South and North America, but also links the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans through the Panama Canal, which is the world's busiest sea trade corridor. Every year, more than 14,000 ships and millions of tons of cargo pass through here. Whoever controls the Caribbean basically controls the trade between the world's two major oceans. Venezuela is right at the center of this trade hotspot. Its coastline along the Caribbean Sea is about 2,800 kilometers long, making it one of the South American countries with the largest coastlines. Along this coastline are major seaports and naval bases like Puerto Cabello, La Guaira, and Maracaibo. The oil-rich Gulf of Venezuela and Lake Maracaibo Basin are not only export hubs, but are also very close to international shipping lanes. And this is both Venezuela's greatest weakness and its strength. On Venezuela's eastern side is the Essequibo region, which is currently in dispute with Guyana. For a long time, this area was neglected, but now large oil reserves have been discovered here, which has further increased the importance of this region. If Venezuela takes control of it, its hold in the Caribbean will increase even more, and it will come very close to the Atlantic trade routes. But this very location of Venezuela also puts it directly in the crosshairs of America and its allies. For example, it is only 800 kilometers from Puerto Rico, just 30 kilometers from Dutch islands like Aruba and Curacao, and just a short flight away from the American base in Florida. This means that if any conflict breaks out in this area, America will automatically get involved. But geography is only half the story. Venezuela's real strength lies hidden beneath its land, and that is oil. Venezuela has the largest oil reserves in the world, nearly 304 billion barrels. This is much more than the 70 billion barrels of reserves in the US, and most of these reserves are here in the Orinoco Belt, which is north of the Orinoco River. This oil is very crude and thick, and it's also very difficult to refine, but it's present in such large quantities that the whole world recognizes Venezuela's importance. It was because of this oil that Venezuela was once one of the richest countries in Latin America. In the 1970s, Venezuela was pumping 3 million barrels of oil every day, and most of it was exported to the United States. At that time, Caracas wasn't just any ordinary capital, it was an energy superpower. Because of this oil, Venezuela saw the rise of huge buildings, highways, and thriving cities. There was a time when Venezuela's per capita GDP was even higher than that of Spain and Greece. Even up until the early 2000s, the fuel used in American cars and ships mostly came from Venezuela. But this very oil also became Venezuela's biggest weakness. At the end of the 1980s, when oil prices fell, Venezuela's economy collapsed. Corruption, mismanagement, and political unrest made the situation even worse. In the 1990s, one economic crisis after another hit. And finally, in 1999, Hugo Chavez became the president of Venezuela. In the beginning, his socialist policies led to a huge boom in the oil industry. But then when oil prices fell in 2010, Venezuela was hit by a severe crisis. By 2015, the economic situation in Venezuela had become extremely dire. After Hugo Chavez's death in 2013, Nicolas Maduro became president. Maduro inherited the Bolivarian Revolution and a devastated economy dangerously dependent on oil. Very soon, inflation reached triple digits and protests erupted across the country. That same year, the opposition gained control of Venezuela's National Assembly, putting Maduro's government in jeopardy. In response, President Maduro began to tighten his grip on power, sidelined institutions, and used security forces to crush the opposition. This was a turning point for Washington. In 2015, the United States officially declared Venezuela a threat to its national security, laying the groundwork for the sanctions that would follow. Since 2015, Washington has imposed more than 900 sanctions on Venezuela, targeting the country's state oil company, banks, shipping, gold exports, and even senior officials. The aim of all this was to deprive Nicolas Maduro's government of funds and force him to step down from power. These sanctions devastated oil production and pushed Venezuela into the worst economic crisis in its history. More than 7 million Venezuelans were forced to seek refuge in Colombia, Brazil, and other countries. But despite all this, Venezuela managed to survive by selling cheap oil to countries like China, India, and Russia. China has invested billions of dollars in Venezuela's oil fields through loans and infrastructure projects. India is buying cheap crude oil from Caracas so that it can refine it in its own country, and Russia has offered financial backing and military cooperation to acquire Venezuelan energy. Even American firms like Chevron are operating under special licenses, because completely blocking Venezuelan oil would reduce global supply and fuel prices for American customers would rise significantly. So basically, these sanctions have devastated Venezuela's economy, but they have completely failed to bring about regime change. Now, a big question here is, why doesn't the US just ignore Venezuela? At first glance, the obvious answer is its strategic location and large oil reserves, but in reality, that's just the beginning. The story behind the scenes is actually very interesting. For Washington, Venezuela represents something much bigger. In fact, it poses a threat to United States control in the Western Hemisphere. Since the Monroe Doctrine of 1823, America has considered Latin America its backyard, meaning a zone where no other country is allowed to interfere. But Venezuela, first under Hugo Chavez and now under Nicolas Maduro, has challenged this ideology. Russian military advisors, Chinese loans, and even Iranian drones are now part of Venezuela's defense system. The Caribbean, which was once considered America's safe zone, has now become crowded with many foreign stakeholders. And it doesn't end there. Venezuela may be in South America, but its oil wealth also connects it to the Middle East. With more than 304 billion barrels of proven oil reserves, the largest in the world, Venezuela is one of the few countries that can shift the global energy balance. For many years, the United States has relied on Middle Eastern oil, which has greatly benefited countries like Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and Iran. The choke points of the Gulf, such as the Strait of Hormuz, Bab el-Mandeb, and the Suez Canal. That's why these became flashpoints, because the world relied heavily on the oil passing through here. But if Washington gains access to Venezuelan oil, which is only 4 days away from its Gulf Coast refineries, it can reduce its reliance on the Middle East. This would greatly reduce Saudi Arabia's influence within OPEC, eliminate Iran's leverage to block this choke point, and even weaken Russia's grip on Europe's energy supply. To put it simply, control over Venezuela is not just important for the United States. It could shift the balance of power in the Middle East and other regions as well. The countries that have been using this oil as leverage could see that leverage permanently threatened. That's why the battle for the Caribbean is much bigger than just Latin America, and that's why things are heating up in the Caribbean. In September 2025, the US Navy attacked ships that were accused of being part of Venezuelan drug smuggling networks. Just a few days later, American forces also boarded a Venezuelan fishing boat in the same sea. For Venezuela, this wasn't an anti-drug operation, but rather an attack on its sovereign. Smart Euro gave a strong response. They announced the deployment of their army, police, and militias in 284 battlefront zones inside Venezuela to defend against this foreign aggression. They said that the threat of war is looming over Venezuela and it's just a few kilometers away from its coastline. But this confrontation is much more than just about controlling drugs or fishing boats. It's a battle for control of the Caribbean Sea. Washington wants to show that it can monitor this region and maintain its influence, while Venezuela wants to prove that it cannot be suppressed. The attacks on drugs and fishing boats are actually warning signs of a much bigger struggle. Unlike the wars in Ukraine or the Middle East, the Caribbean is right at America's doorstep. America's southern ports, its Gulf oil refineries, and the Panama Canal all rely on shipping routes that pass through these very waters. Any disruption here would have an immediate impact on American trade, energy, and military. That's why an aggressive Venezuela, especially one backed by Russia, China, and Iran, is a major threat to the US. For Venezuela, this entire crisis is also also very important. President Maduro is facing economic crisis and political instability at home, so a conflict in the Caribbean gives him an opportunity to unite his nation. By militarizing the coastal areas, deploying troops in these battlefront zones, and forming alliances with foreign powers, he can challenge American imperialism. This will strengthen his grip on power, while making things more complicated for Washington. But history shows how dangerous this kind of conflict can be. In 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis nearly led to nuclear war in the Caribbean, and even today, the geography hasn't changed at all. Florida is still very close to these waters, the Panama Canal is still a global choke point, and these islands remain vulnerable. What has changed are the players. Instead of Cuba and the Soviet Union, now it's Venezuela, backed by Moscow, Beijing, and Tehran, openly challenging the US. The question now isn't whether the Caribbean is important or not, but how far both countries are willing to go. Will Washington risk a new conflict so close to home? Or will Venezuela, with the backing of its powerful friends, force America to back down? If you liked the video, be sure to share it with others so our content can reach more people. See you in the next video. Take care of yourself. Allah Hafiz.